Welcome back. In this video we're going to look at three basic concepts. One is the concept of voluntary exchange. We're also going to talk about different ways that the government can manipulate a supply and demand situation through different government controls, and then we'll also talk about elasticity versus inelasticity. The first thing we're going to look at is with voluntary exchange. In any of the supply and demand graphs or situations we've looked at, we're trying to figure out the equilibrium price. In any of these situations, at any of the price points, whenever this transaction takes place, it takes place voluntarily. And so we're going to look at this dynamic and why it's a voluntary exchange. Remember, with demand, we're looking for consumers who are willing and able to buy, and we're looking for producers who are willing and able to sell or to make that product. And so in a free market system, if it's truly free market, then buyers and sellers always will voluntarily come together to seek mutual benefit. So when we're talking about voluntary exchange, this is what we're looking for, is how do we know that it's mutually beneficial? In a free market system, if it is mutually beneficial, then the deal gets done, and if it's not, then one party will walk away. Let's look at an example. You want to buy a truck, you go to the local dealership, you have what we call a maximum price that you're willing to spend. So in this example, you're willing to spend up to $20,000. Well, if the price goes over $20,000, that's the point where you would walk away. Obviously, you're not looking to pay $20,000, but that's as much as you're willing to pay. The seller also has a price that he's not willing to sell it for less than, and so in this example, it's $15,000. Obviously, the seller wants to get more, but if it price drops below $15,000, he's losing money, therefore would walk away. After negotiation, you end up buying the truck for $18,000. So let's look to see how this is mutually beneficial. We said the buyer's maximum was $20,000. Right? Again, that was the price that you were willing to pay up to. The seller's minimum in this example is $15,000. After negotiation, both parties agreed to the price, the final selling price of $18,000. And so we see here, buyer's maximum of $20,000, a seller's minimum of $15,000, and the final negotiated price at $18,000. Now really, we could look and ask the question of who wins. And on the surface, you might think, well, the seller won because there was $3,000 difference between what they were willing to accept and what they ultimately got in negotiations, and where the buyer only netted $2,000, if you will. This introduces the concept of consumer and producer surplus, because the real answer to that question is both parties won. As a consumer, you were willing to pay $20,000, and yet you only had to pay $18,000. So you walked away with a gain or a net of $2,000 that you would have been able and willing to spend. The producer also netted $3,000, so they both came out ahead, and that's why we call it the consumer and producer surplus. Consumer and producer surplus. So when we're talking about looking for is the difference that either as a consumer you're willing to pay and what you actually pay. Again, that's what we call the buyer's maximum, what you're willing to pay versus the price you ultimately pay. And for producer surplus, it's the difference between what you're willing to sell it for and how much you actually sell it for. So this time for producer surplus, it's price minus what we call the seller's minimum. Now we can show what the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is on our graph. So let's take a look at where we can find that information. Again, here's our basic supply and demand curve: downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. And again, this would be the market for any particular product. Again, with any graph, you want to label your equilibrium point. And what we see is if you were to trace that equilibrium point to the price axis, the area above that equilibrium line up to the upper reaches of your price, again under that demand curve, represents the area of our consumer surplus. Again, at any point on there, because that equilibrium price is set at $5, that's what you are going to pay. Even if you're willing to pay $10 or $8, because that equilibrium price is at 5, that's ultimately what the price the market is going to ask for, and therefore you're not going to voluntarily pay more than what the market is asking for. Same with producer surplus, which is that area below that equilibrium line and above the supply curve. Same is true. There were suppliers who were willing to sell it for $1. There are suppliers who were willing to sell it for $2, and yet because the market bore the price of $5, that's what they ultimately would sell it for, because again, that's the equilibrium price. It's where the market dictates the price goes. And so we can see on our supply and demand graph where our consumer surplus and producer surplus are. We'll come back to that in a second once we introduce some of these government controls or ways the government can get involved in these different markets. So let's go ahead and look at those producer surplus in just a second, and we'll revisit. We're going to look at these 4 primary ways that governments can get involved: price controls, import quota, subsidies, and excise taxes. So let's take them one at a time. Let's go price controls first, then price ceilings. So the first one we'll look at is a price gasoline. A price ceiling is simply going to be the maximum legal price a seller can charge for a product. So the government believes the price of gasoline is too high. They would go in and set a price ceiling, which is the maximum price that somebody could sell for that product, in essence trying to lower the price. Again, the goal of any price ceiling is to make that product more affordable, which also lets you know that with a price ceiling, you always want to come in below that equilibrium price. For instance, if the price ceiling was set at $4, well, the price would never get above $3 because that's where the equilibrium price is. Therefore, the equilibrium price would still be dictating the price, not the price ceiling. What we see with any price ceiling is, again, because it's going to be set below that equilibrium price, is it's going to create a situation of a shortage. What we see, though, is because it creates a shortage, even though it lowers the price, in the long run, it's not going to be beneficial to all consumers. By creating that shortage, it's cutting some consumers out of the market who would have been able to purchase those goods before, simply because it creates a disincentive for suppliers to produce that product. Again, we see a shortage from our equilibrium price to where our price ceiling has set it, where we lose 10 units that would have been produced, therefore cutting out some people who would have been able to consume that product. Let's look at the price floor. Now, again, already kind of have an idea. If price ceiling is the maximum price somebody can sell it for, price floor is the minimum price somebody can sell it for. And this time we have the opposite goal. We're trying to protect suppliers more so with the price floor, whereas with the price ceiling you're trying to benefit or protect consumers. Here with the price floor, you want to keep the market price high. So we'd want a price floor to go above our equilibrium price. Again, somewhat kind of tricky to think about. You want to put the price floor above that equilibrium price because it prevents any prices from going below. You can't go lower than the floor. Same with the ceiling. You want to set it below your equilibrium point because you can't go any higher than that price ceiling, therefore preventing you from getting to that equilibrium point. Again, what we see with any price floor situation, if it's set above that equilibrium point, it's going to create a surplus. Suppliers are going to produce more than they otherwise would because they're going to get a higher price than they otherwise would have if the free market would have worked. And so what we see is on the surface it looks like it does help corn producers, just like a price ceiling on the surface looks like it does help consumers. But what we see is a situation when we go back and look at our consumer and producer surplus, we can show how ultimately price ceilings, price floors lead to inefficiencies in the marketplace. And so when we talk about price controls, we have to separate the difference between economic theory and political theory. From a political standpoint, price ceilings, price floors may be very beneficial. And so Congress or state legislatures may look to put those in place because it's going to help constituents. It may help them ultimately get reelected. It may just be good politics. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good economics, and here's why. If we go ahead and add in our consumer and producer surplus areas to our supply and demand graph, what we see is with what we
price
see is
ceiling
with or price floor is we create the situation where it changes our consumer surplus and our producer surplus. Again, originally we would go from that equilibrium line, and above that equilibrium line and below the demand curve would be our consumer surplus, and then below that equilibrium line and above the supply curve would be our producer surplus. What happens in this example with the price floor is it raises where the consumer surplus would fall, shrinking that area, and also increases the area of the producer surplus. Again, price floors are meant to benefit producers. But what we also see is this area from the equilibrium point where nobody will buy or consume anymore. And so what we call this area is our dead weight loss. So this area in gray or silver is the area that represents inefficiency. It's area that would have been consumer or producer surplus, where a transaction would have taken place, but it no longer does not because of that price control. So in this example, the price floor results in lost consumer surplus and producer surplus, and it leads to dead weight loss or inefficiency. For macro, that's as far as we need to take it. In microeconomics, we would actually figure out and calculate how much dead weight loss there is. Nothing that you need to worry about. As long as you can recognize where dead weight loss exists, you'll be fine. Show you an example with a price ceiling, just so you can see it. Again, same thing's going to hold true. This time our consumer surplus increases. Again, price ceiling benefits consumers, our producer surplus shrinks, and yet we still end up with dead weight loss. Alright, so again, either situation, a price floor or price ceiling, you're going to end up with some inefficiency, some dead weight loss, which we're trying to prevent. We're trying to avoid in a free market system. The second type of control are import quotas. We'll come back to this a little bit more when we talk about international trade, but just to introduce them, because you will see them kind of throughout this semester. But an import quota is simply any quota or a limit on a particular product, the number of products that can enter. Government's going to set the maximum amount that can enter the country, so it could be different for different products. Some of the reasons why there might be import quotas is simply to protect domestic producers. So if other countries can produce a product cheaper, obviously people would prefer to buy the cheaper product. By limiting that cheaper product from entering your marketplace, it's going to keep that the prices slightly higher, therefore benefiting domestic producers. It also helps elevate domestic employment, simply because they still are producing those products that otherwise may not be competitive on a global marketplace. Another example is subsidies. This is where the government provides money, gives money to producers with the goal of them producing more of that product. So it could be anything that the government thinks is important, like agriculture. It could be certain pharmaceutical subsidies. The government wants to support the production of new medicines and therefore subsidizes those. We've seen subsidies issued for environmentally safe vehicles. So like hybrid cars, they've offered subsidies before to help lower the price. And even something that a lot of you will be dealing with now, FAFSA, and student loans. A lot of the government issued loans that are in essence a subsidy, trying to lower the overall cost that you would have to assume for paying for college. So all of those would be examples of subsidies. The last of those government interventions or government involvements that we saw were excise taxes. An excise tax is a per unit tax on a producer. So it's not just a lump sum tax, but it's something they pay a tax on for every single unit that they produce. We often see these excise taxes put on products that the government deems dangerous or that they simply are trying to get rid of or eliminate. And so we often call these excise taxes sin taxes because they're taxes that are not designed primarily to generate revenue, but to limit a certain type of product or limit a certain type of behavior. So, I mean, we see examples with cigarettes, raising a per pack tax on cigarettes is really just designed to limit and reduce smoking, not necessarily to generate revenue like we would think of with taxes. We see a tax on alcohol, very similar. Tariffs on imported goods or environmentally unsafe products may have an excise tax attached to them, all again with the design of limiting their exposure in the marketplace and trying to reduce the overall usage of those products. So those are the government controls that we're going to look at. And the last thing, I just showed you the difference between an elastic curve and an inelastic curve. And so we'll do that by showing you an example with the demand curve. If you ever see something that talks about the elasticity or the inelasticity of a curve, and realize this could work for demand and for supply, we're just happening to show you a demand example. Really all you're looking for is the shape of the curve. Now when something is considered elastic, like our blue curve, our blue demand line, all we're saying is because the line is more horizontal, whenever there's a small change in price, you're going to have a large change in quantity demanded. So a small change in price, large change in quantity demanded, that particular product that has an elastic demand curve is going to be very responsive to a change in price. So any small degrees of price change are going to lead to massive changes in the quantity demanded. An inelastic curve or more vertical demand curve or supply curve are going to be related to products that are not dependent on price. So even a large change in price is going to result in a relatively small change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied, which we see there with the red demand curve. And so again, anytime you see a question related to elasticity, simply look at the shape of your curve. If it's more horizontal, that means it's going to be much more elastic. And if it's more vertical, then it's going to be very inelastic. And again, you're just looking for how responsive to a change in price that the product is. That's all we've got for today. Thank you guys for watching.